Today we're talking about concepting in 3D with ZBrush and Toolbag. Let's take a look. What's going on, guys? Eric, and today we're going to take a look at a time lapse of an ogre I made last week over the course of a couple nights. And I want to talk a little bit about concepting in 3D, specifically using ZBrush and Toolbag, but it's more bigger picture than that. We're not going to do like a step-by-step tutorial. We're kind of just going to talk through the process and talk a little bit about the general idea of concepting in 3D and what that means, and a little bit about where I'm at in my own personal art and what kind of motivated me to make this video today. So we're going to go ahead and just start running the time lapse and we can kind of go from there. So I'm curious if you guys share this, but one of the problems I have with personal work is the desire to make every asset I make completely finished in the sense that it's production ready, so that, you know, I do a high poly, a low poly, bake the maps, do the topology, like everything is perfect and ready and showcases everything I can do as a game artist. And I have a feeling this is probably a pretty common sentiment. And I think it kind of comes from, you know, trying to get your first job or trying to get a job and trying to have a portfolio that really showcases all your work. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and it's something that really bothers me because we are artists and we got into this because we love games and we love art and that sort of thing. And so in my personal work, I've been thinking more about shifting from creating 3D models that are production ready and ready to go to just creating images, and 3D being a medium to help me generate that image. And I'm only kind of just starting on this journey. It's something that I've just been thinking about and kind of kicking off with this ogre and hopefully doing a lot more of down the road. But, you know, kind of the idea of just using 3D as a way to tell a story or create an image or just create a visual that isn't necessarily for the purpose of being like a game character or a game ready character, that kind of thing. And working this way lets you iterate a lot faster and lets you see results a lot faster than just building characters for the sake of building characters. And it's tough because obviously you do want to have that portfolio that showcases everything you can do and shows you can do retopology and shows you can bake maps and this and that. And I think maybe there's a balance to be struck there between having stuff that's ready to go, production ready, and just having cool artwork that you can showcase. Obviously, making everything production ready is a way slower process, and as a result, you're gonna have far fewer things in your portfolio. And so maybe this idea of having a couple things that showcase your technical ability, but then also doing stuff for the sake of making cool art that isn't constrained to all the technical limitations that you might have to do at a studio or at games, and just making a cool picture. And I know this isn't a revolutionary concept, like plenty of artists just make cool images and render cool images. I mean, ArtStation is full of them. It's just, for me, a personal struggle that I've had overcoming to feel comfortable doing that stuff. And I think that's an accumulation of a lot of things. Of course, this fear of having to have a portfolio that showcases my ability and shows that I am a hireable artist, but, you know, also just kind of figuring out what my style is and what things I want to show or what things I want to tell through images and through art too. And just doing a cool character is kind of like a way to circumvent trying to figure out your identity as an artist. When you think about producing an image instead, suddenly it's a whole different set of parameters that you have to consider in terms of the story and the image that you're trying to create. And on top of that, I've been in a position the past couple of years where I've been fortunate enough to interview and hire artists of different levels, from junior to mid and senior. And this is something I'm still kind of thinking about and developing. But I think when I'm thinking about junior artists, I would almost prefer to see that they have some strong art foundation and some strong sense for proportions and anatomy and form and color and all those kind of art basics, rather than really good topology and really good bakes. Obviously that stuff is important and want to show that you can do that stuff, but I can teach you that stuff. The art side of things can be taught, but it takes a lot longer to hone in, I think. And so if I had to choose, I mean, of course, it depends on the role in the studio and all those sort of things. I would prefer somebody who has strong art fundamentals, but needs to catch up on the technical end more than someone who's strong technically, but their proportions are way off or their anatomy is way off. And obviously, as a senior artist or lead or anyone in a more senior position, part of your responsibility is mentoring junior artists to help them grow as artists and develop their ability as artists. But sometimes you don't always get that luxury at studios, especially small studios who don't have a lot of spare cycles and spare time to train people. And so being able to find someone that has some strong art fundamentals goes a long way. So I don't know, some people might disagree with that take, and that's fine. I'd definitely be curious to know what you guys think in the comments and stuff, so let me know. But why don't we talk a little bit about what's actually going on screen right now. So like we've been discussing, I wanted to do something, rough, just kind of dirty, but also be able to walk away from it with an actual rendered image. And for that, I really like the combo of Zbrush and Marmoset Toolbag. Obviously, you could use Unreal or Blender or Arnold or whatever renderer you want, or even just rendering in Zbrush. But the idea is to just take a sculpt or high poly and be able to bring that into a renderer and create a cool image with it. And I like the workflow with Toolbag. And so I was going to do something humanoid, so I just kind of started scribbling a character and then working out forms and stuff. As I started to block it out, I realized it would be cool to do an ogre. I think even at one point I wanted him to, at one point I was even considering him being like one of the WoW ogres that have like a spiky horn on their forehead, but I tried it and then brought it in the Toolbag and I hated it. So I kind of just went with more of like a standard fantasy ogre instead. And then once I knew I wanted to do a portrait, I decided to add the lower body and decided to add the lower torso and kind of give myself more framing options rather than just a super head close-up. As I was working on this, there was a bunch of things I realized that are pretty cool. And, one is that I'm not concerned about like, oh, you need all the detail to look really good up close, or every dimension of him needs to be perfectly rendered. Since I knew I was just going to do a front-on render, I only had to like rough out the proportions of the back, but not take it to completion, for example. And then when we get into the micro detail sculpting, I knew I just needed it to be convincing enough from a distance, not from super up close. And so I was able to kind of just roughly sculpt wrinkles and sculpt the lips and add some alphas for pores and stuff like that and get a good enough result for the image. And the reason I knew that is because even though I don't include it in this video, the entire time that I'm working, I already have the model exported and somewhat set up in Toolbag so that I can continuously export from ZBrush, Alt Tab over to Toolbag and see the results. And I can continue to iterate based on what I'm seeing in Toolbag. And I definitely recommend that way to work. Even in production environments, I always recommend people work that way as well, where as soon as you possibly can, get your asset set up in Engine so you can start seeing the results, because a lot of times your texturing program like Substance or Quixel or whatever you're using, the viewport result isn't going to look the same as your engine, and you're going to have to learn how to distinguish and how to calibrate for your engine based off the offset results from the two viewports. So that might be less of an issue with hyper realistic stuff that's following stringent PBR guidelines and material definition and stuff. You might have closer results, but for stylized stuff where you might have weird lighting or some kind of trickery happening on your side that the viewport that you're texturing in doesn't account for, it's always kind of good practice to get that stuff set up as quickly as possible so you can jump back and forth and see results. So at this stage, I'm really just focusing on kind of his personality and where I actually want to take this character. I knew that I wanted him to be kind of like an old orc or a ogre or like a beat up weathered ogre where he's seen a lot of shit. And so, just kind of adding a lot of imperfections in his face and his body and that sort of thing. So yeah, really just trying to find that personality and kind of find what I'm trying to make. And I think that's what's kind of cool about this idea of concepting in 3D is that don't worry about getting too refined. The whole purpose is to stay rough so that you can just try stuff, smooth it out, erase it, try something else, smooth it out, erase it. Like, you're not getting married to anything. You're not getting married to topology, anything like that. You can just kind of iterate and change and riff and stay super rough. And then if you do want to do this, for creating images or creating renders at some stage, you're like, okay, I can start cleaning this up. But like I mentioned, you can kind of get an idea for what you want your final image to be and only detail and finalize based on what you want your final image to be, instead of feeling like you need to perfectly complete and polish the entire model. Yeah, I think that's like a huge benefit for this. Even if you're not doing something where, you've done the topology and the bakes and all that stuff, if the artistic value is there and it's attractive, employers are still going to notice one way or the other. And obviously, if you only have that stuff and you don't have anything that shows technical ability, that could be an issue. But yeah, I think having some of this stuff where you just make really cool characters for the sake of making cool characters that aren't made for games, I think that's perfectly acceptable. And let me know how you guys feel about that too. I also knew that I wanted to add hair to this character, and so initially I was like, I'm just going to use fiber mesh. I can just use fiber mesh to get some basic hair that's going to be good enough for a render. But after playing with fiber mesh for a bit, I realized how much I hate fiber mesh, and I realized how much I hate the groom tools with fiber mesh. I just find them so cumbersome and tedious, and maybe it's something that I'm missing that I just don't have the hang of, but I really don't like using them. And so ultimately I end up using Xgen, and I think that Xgen is such a fast workflow anyways that it's still a perfectly acceptable tool for this kind of work. because I think in one night I was able to get all the different descriptions of hair that I wanted to achieve with him, and then was able to just kind of iterate and polish it a little bit. And it's not perfect. It's very rough, but it's good enough for the feeling and the mood of this character that I wanted to get across. And I didn't do any paint over in Photoshop, but I think oftentimes people, when they take this approach, they will take their final render or image and then do some painting and modification in Photoshop to really make it pop. But in my case, I knew I was going to do the little sequence in the beginning of the video where I'm rendering it, so I didn't want to do too much fakeness for an image. And I just kind of did it all out of the render. But I do like color correct and stuff after the fact. And I don't know if this is a thing that other 3D artists do, but I started doing this because of my photography background. But I actually like to take my renders and bring them into Lightroom and try different filters and try different looks as if I was color grading a photo, because you can totally get like a different mood and stuff. And I think this is an interesting workflow to be able to do. Like, take your render and then apply like filters that you might use for photography or for Instagram or something, and just see the different results, because you can get some cool things that you may not have just figured out from your lighting. So I don't know. It's a way I like to work, and I think it's pretty cool. Even if you don't actually use that Lightroom final look, maybe you just use it for inspiration to modify your lighting or modify your scene back in your engine or in your renderer. So why don't we go ahead and talk about Xgen a little bit. We're not going to do a full tutorial on this. This is just a time lapse of Xgen and my process. But if you're interested in seeing like a full Xgen tutorial, I know enough that I could probably talk about it. So if you're interested about that, definitely leave a comment. But it's something I just kind of do for fun. But yeah, I like Xgen a lot, and I tend to prefer to use the curves as guides for Xgen, not the interactive grooming. I just think that gives you way more control and it's easier to manage. And so that's what we're doing here. I left this little blooper in where I was actually moving the CVs, the control points of the guides, until I remembered, oh wait, Xgen has a grooming brush that you can use to just move these without having to go into their control vertexes. So I don't know, just kind of a thing that I haven't used it in a little while and I forgot, and I just want to leave that in. But yeah, you can use the little icon up top there where that lets you basically paint them in a direction, so you can kind of use that to change their flow and their shape and stuff. And so it works really well. And one of the cool things about Xgen is the collection and descriptions. And so your collection is like your overall character. So you can do like ogre collection. I called it hair collection, but it doesn't matter. And the descriptions can be each kind of different type of hair that character might have. So, you know, the collection is the group, and then you have the subcategories, which are the descriptions. So that can be like your head hair, your eyebrows, your peach fuzz, that sort of thing. And you have all these different groups, and each of those have their own unique Xgen settings that you can swap between, but you don't have to go to a whole different collection. And I like that quite a bit. I think it's cool. Make sure if you're using Xgen, you're setting and creating a project in Maya. All those masks need somewhere to save. And so if you're not working in a project, it's going to lose all that work next time you go back to Maya. So make sure you have a project set that you can go back to when you're working on Xgen stuff. And if you're not familiar at all with Xgen, the basic workflow is you've got the overall kind of settings, the length, width, taper, the region mask, and then you've got what's called modifiers. And the modifiers really change the look and style of the hair that you're going for. And so some basic modifiers are clumping and noise. Clumping kind of creates these groups of hair, hair naturally clumps together because of oils and stuff like that. And so gives you a lot of settings on how you control those clumps. And often in a more detailed groom, you'll do multiple clumps. So you might have your very large ones, and then you'll do another clumping modifier to create kind of smaller ones that break up those bigger clumps and add more variety. And then you use things like noise to make the hair feel more unkept or a little more random, so it's not perfectly slicked back. And so I'm going pretty strong on the noise with him because I really wanted him to be like disheveled and worn. And obviously an ogre is not going to like take care of his hair, like put pomade in it or something, or hairspray. So he's got rough hair, and I wanted to make sure I kind of kept that through all of his different hair descriptions. And so one of the downsides to using Toolbag, if you're trying to do hair, is that Toolbag doesn't have alembic cache, or curve support. So you guys may have seen in Unreal 5, you can export your curves outside of Xgen and import them into Unreal, and Unreal will generate the hair in Unreal. And that also gives you a bunch of data that you can use to texture the hair, like root to tip information and other information like that. That gives you a lot of control. With Toolbag, all you can do is just export your hair as geometry and then import it as geo in the Toolbag. And it does try to UV it, so you could try to give it like some gradient and whatnot, but you're not going to get a lot of color control working this way, unfortunately. So that is a downside. I'm definitely hoping that Toolbag adds curve support. I feel like that would be such a good update to the program and really do this kind of work, like really help this kind of workflow along. Especially, for characters in general, just having more control over the hair is such a strong thing, especially now that it seems like we might be moving towards more real-time hair than hair cards. Obviously, that's going to take years to fully switch over, but Unreal 5 is showing us that it is possible, and that could be the future. So, lower end stuff is still going to use hair cards and whatnot, but we could be doing full grooms for games, in the next 5 years. So I think that's pretty cool. But yeah, to export your hair as geo, it's pretty easy. You just need to make sure that in the primitives tab, you're unchecking face camera. So make sure face camera is unchecked. And then you can go in and just hit the hair to poly strips up in the Xgen panel up top there, and it'll turn it into geo. And then you can just export that and import it into Toolbag, and it'll give you a good result. At this stage, I'm mostly finished with him. I knew that I wanted to age him up a little bit and make him look a little more disheveled. So at first I kind of had just like basic skin color without a lot of detail, but I decided to go back to poly paint and add a lot of moles and blemishes and things like that so that he felt a lot more aged and beat up. Just kind of adding all those imperfections and adding more subtle coloration in the skin, just using basic ZBrush alphas, and also just adding some veins and stuff and scars and little things like that. It just kind of helps the final look of him, and still is pretty fast. So overall, when you're just trying to do a render of your high poly, poly paint is a great quick way to add color and convincingness. And like I mentioned, I'm alt tabbing between Toolbag and ZBrush for this whole process, just kind of seeing what works, seeing what doesn't, and what additional detail I need. Like, I think I even went back and added more bumps and more roughness to his face because I just noticed it was looking a little too smooth in the render. And so just kind of really playing that up until I felt like it hit kind of the age and feel that I wanted for him. All right, so I did not film the whole process of setting it up in Toolbag because that was kind of in the background the whole time that I was working, but I thought we could at least go through my scene setup and talk about it a little bit. And there's nothing super fancy going on here. Basically, I set up my camera. I usually use like a 50mm or an 85mm for portraits. That's just kind of like standards when you come to like portrait photography and stuff like that. So that's what I like to go with for basic portraits. I chose 50 for him. And then for tone mapping, I don't like to keep it on linear. I think some people might like linear, but I don't really like the result. And so I switched it to Hegel or whatever. You can also use like Aces or a different one too. I just like the look of Hegel. I think it gives a good look, and I can kind of work on top of it pretty well. For the sky, there's nothing super crazy going on. I just using a HDR out of the Marmoset library. And then I'm using 3 lights. 2 of them are rim lights to kind of just really fill in around his outline. And then 1 light that is like the fill light to just add some extra depth to his front there. And on my lights, I always make sure to increase the diameter of the light a little bit to make sure that I get soft shadows. I don't like having real harsh shadows. So you can play with that diameter adjustment to kind of get, think of it as like a skybox, or not a skybox, sorry, a softbox. Like the bigger the softbox, the softer the shadows. That's kind of what you're doing with that. You're making the light source larger, which in turn softens the shadows, versus a smaller light source is going to give you very hard shadows. So keep that in mind. I also have a couple other skyboxes in here that we can run through. Those were just different looks. One of them was more of like a flash photography setup. One of them is just different altogether. And whenever I'm setting something up, I usually always, even if I'm really happy with my first result, I like to set up a couple other alternatives just in case there's a look or something that I'm not thinking about. And maybe it helps me even adjust my final light setup. So keep that in mind. Like, don't be afraid to play and try different things, even if you think you really like what you have. You never know what could happen. So for the scene itself, there's no fancy organization or anything like that. I'm just importing all of my meshes. I've got misspelled ogre, and then all of the hair descriptions that I had exported as geometry. And make sure on your hair you're going to the mesh in Toolbag and unchecking back face masking, so that you're getting rendering on both sides, because those are just poly strips. So yeah, just make sure you do that. And then also, of course, you can decide with the skybox if you want to blur the background image or if you just want it to be a solid color and you're going to render with transparency and add a background after the fact. I was fine just having a blurred HDR in the background for this because I liked the kind of him looking like a forest ogre dude. So I thought it was fine. I wasn't doing anything too crazy here. For the shaders, they're all pretty basic. Now that Marmoset Toolbag has ray tracing, when I do skin shaders, I use the volumetric subsurface scattering instead of the other option. I think it gives you a little bit more realistic result. And I think on average, the scatter depth for humans is like 1.8. And so you can use that as like a starting base, but then I'll tweak that based on the look of the character. And so I ended up going a little bit lower, around 1.6. And that worked. Oh, and the gloss map. Let me go back to that, or roughness map. So I did end up adding a roughness map to him because I wanted a little bit more wetness on his lips in certain areas. I think I could push it even further, to be honest, but this is kind of the drawback to working this way if you're just trying to export a character with poly paint. You probably could do the texturing like in Toolbag. That wasn't something that I considered, that I think I'll try next time. But basically what I did is I went to UV Master in ZBrush and just did a quick auto unwrap with UV Master, and then subdivided him, filled him with a black color, and then just painted grays and lighter colors where I wanted it to be a little wetter. Once I was happy, I just went ahead and converted the poly paint to texture and exported the texture and used that as my roughness map. So the albedo color is still vertex paint. I didn't need to turn that into a map, but the roughness I did turn into a texture map so I could apply it under the roughness panel. So just a little trick if you need the extra kind of wetness in certain areas. The hair shaders are pretty basic. I am using anisotropic for the hair, and I am using subsurface, which kind of helps the hairs blend together a little bit better. Like I mentioned, since you can't really have a lot of color control in Toolbag when you're dealing with geometry hair, it's just really difficult. You can kind of use the spec to fake color variation, which for him works because he's kind of got like gray hair, and so it just kind of tricks you into thinking there's like different shades of gray when really that's just specular highlights popping off. And overall, I think it works fine. The eyes, I actually ended up buying the eyes off of ArtStation from an artist. I'll link those in the description below. I also bought a tutorial of his that teaches you how to make those eyes, which I've never done in a ray trace environment before. So I'm excited to run through that and kind of learn how to make hyper realistic eyes myself. It's not something I've ever done before, so definitely excited to give that a try. And then yeah, and that was something I really learned with this workflow, is that having a library that you can pull from, like eyes or maybe jewelry or any kind of accessories, would definitely speed this up in terms of ideation and concepting in 3D. Being able to pull stuff without having to make everything from scratch every time kind of really helps reinforce the entire purpose of this exercise, which is to take an idea and get it into something that you can show, or something that represents a more realistic finalized image rather than just like a screenshot out of ZBrush, for example. I think that's it really. So like I mentioned in the beginning, kind of a different video, just talking about this idea of creating images rather than 3D models, and the benefits of concepting in 3D, and how fast you can actually iterate with tools like Toolbag and tools like ZBrush now. It's super cool. So if you're feeling a little burnt out on a project or something like that, definitely give it a try. Overall, yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. If there's topics or questions or anything you want to talk about, leave me a comment in the comments below. I always try to get back to those as soon as I can. And of course, please consider subscribing or hitting the thumbs up. I appreciate that. Don't stop creating. Everybody have a great week and take care. I'll see you next time.